Tanse Taweo. So this is the beginning of our initial unit on Indigenous experiences, and we'll have a long conversation about that. But Tanse Taweo is hello in Cree, because that is the language of the people whose territory we occupy now, more or less. It's a little more complicated than that. We're going to talk a little bit about Indigenous experiences today, and this is sort of the first, there's a couple of them in the course of the semester, but this is the first sort of unit in this semester where I'm actually missing my PowerPoints, and the only reason I'm missing them, or the important reason that I'm missing them right now, is because my PowerPoints let me show you maps. So, there is a PowerPoint for this entire unit. It basically just has the maps and like a couple of things that I didn't really want to sit here and read to you verbatim. And the first one of those is actually a map that I'd really like you guys to take a look at right now. And the first thing that I sort of want to talk about in this unit is to say that it's really, really common in North America and in sort of especially in media and in a lot of news coverage to talk about Indigenous people say X or Indigenous people experienced X. And those statements might be true in the sense that there may be Indigenous people who did experience or say those things, but it's really important to understand that the first thing that I need you to understand about this, about Indigenous experiences in Canada, is that S at the end is really important, that these experiences are plural. So if you look at that first map that I've given you, one of the things that you'll recognize very quickly is that there's a whole lot of colors on that. And be aware that that's not groups of Indigenous people, that's language groups, and it's entirely possible to have significant cultural differences over the same language group. So the first thing that I want to talk about is that the experience of Indigenous people in Canada is incredibly varied. And it's varied for a variety of different reasons, right? When you have that many language groups and you have that much variation across the country, you just have some very initial sort of differences in how things fit together, right? If you remember, we talked about the idea of civilization a couple of weeks ago as requiring written language and permanent settlements, okay? Um, that looks very different, or rather, you get compared very differently to those standards if you live on the west coast of British Columbia. Because on the west coast of British Columbia, and in certain parts of sort of the Great Lakes area for the Iroquois in some ways, um, your settlements look more permanent to European settlers when they arrive, right? So when you are looking at, for example, the Cree, who lived in most of Alberta, those settlements move every couple of weeks. That doesn't look permanent to European settlers for the most part. And that kind of difference can create some important challenges, right? But by the same token, some nomadic Indigenous groups were able to protect their way of life quite well. Notably, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but through most of the territories of Canada, they managed to maintain ways of life in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of people understanding their way of life, mostly because they had really way less contact with settler populations. Settler populations didn't tend to go north very often or very frequently, or very early. And that sort of idea about the degree of contact is also really, really important because it means that in some ways, the further west you go, okay, the more ways of life for Indigenous groups get disrupted, sort of. We'll talk about a couple of exceptions to that, but the sort of classic example of that would be, if any of you guys remember, I know I had to read this poem like 6 times going through elementary school reading comprehension, but if you remember reading poems about the last of the Beowulf book, there are some Indigenous groups that are native to Canada or existed in Canada, sort of early, before contact with Europeans, and they are entirely extinct. So there's that kind of experience. And then there's experiences sort of, again, going further west, where there's sort of more preservation of those experiences. And the languages are a little bit healthier. That's not a perfect sort of preservation. I mentioned this on the discussion boards a little while ago, but the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy still maintains its own claim of land and actually issues its own passports. So that sort of space of cultural preservation is quite different than, for example, some of the Saulteaux around here on the prairies, just in terms of having access to treaties, having the ability to preserve um, cultural structures and cultural decision-making bodies. All of those things are really, really important. So first things first, you need to understand about Indigenous experiences in Canada is that they're varied. And on top of that, it's also really important to understand that there is a tendency to homogenize them. We'll get into this as we sort of talk about things like residential schools, but we sort of assume, and this is the way the conversation goes, right? This isn't the fact, but the way that the conversation often goes is to say that all Indigenous children experience residential schools. And that isn't true, right? That there are a lot of Indigenous students who never attended residential schools. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not affected by them, but they never attended them. And there's a tendency for non-Indigenous people especially, to homogenize and assume that all Indigenous people in Canada had the same experience. And it's really important for you guys to understand, that that 100% is not the case.